What's going on, everyone, and welcome into Blizzon's podcast, filled to the brim with glitchy analysis and freezing cold takes, so cold that they're boiling hot. In this episode, we're going to be closing out our SEC college football preview, and we're going to be covering the Vanderbilt Commodores. Let's go ahead and talk about the stars. If this was any other team, I would not label these players per se as stars, but these are going to be the best players on this team. Cedric Alexander, a running back, last year had a pretty average season for a Vanderbilt running back, but this year, I expect with a new quarterback, he's going to be getting a ton of touches. And if you're going to see Vanderbilt scoring, it's probably going to be at the hands of Cedric Alexander. On the defensive side of the ball, we've got Langston Patterson, who I think is going to lead the team in tackles. Could he play on another SEC team and start? Potentially, but in my opinion, this is probably one of the better players on Vanderbilt's defense. Somebody to keep an eye out for when it comes to maybe leading the SEC in tackles, but not really somebody that you would talk about, winning the best linebacker of the year award or anything like that. So let's get into the first storyline. What can we expect? The answer, like most Vanderbilt seasons, not a lot. I think they've had 3 winning seasons in the 21st century, and I do not think this is going to be one of them. When you play in a conference where you are the worst team year in and year out, it's really hard to expect anything at all. I mean, Vanderbilt last year was struggling to beat Hawaii, and they lost against Wake Forest when they lost Sam Hartman, their star quarterback. So I think when you're Vanderbilt and you've got all of these major talent issues because you have an academic standard like they do, there's not a lot that you can expect as a fan of the Commodores in a year, basically. So now let's get into the key losses for this team. At quarterback, A.J. Swan transfers out. And this is what is so ironic about Vanderbilt. A.J. Swan was the starter last year for this team, and he transfers to LSU to be the backup. I'm not really sure why he did that, but he goes to take a backup position for LSU. Will Shepard transfers out to Colorado. He was the receiving leader last year. I think he was actually really talented, and I think he's going to do well in Colorado, but transfers out of Vanderbilt. I think he had about 600 yards of receiving last year. So Will Shepard's gone. Nate Clifton, who I think was probably the best player from last year's team, he transfers out, goes to USC. He was the sacks leader for this team last year. I think he was tied for it, but still the sacks leader nonetheless. That is a massive loss for this team. And when we talk about the additions, I didn't really see him getting replaced at all. So now let's talk about the key additions to this team. There's only 2 I want to talk about. Diego Pavia, a quarterback from New Mexico State, played really well against Auburn, I think. I was really impressed with what he was able to do, but is he going to be able to do that on a consistent basis with a Vanderbilt team who is understaffed in the wide receiver position? Probably not, but he is going to be a quarterback to look out for. And then on the other end, we've got another quarterback, Nate Johnson, the backup quarterback who got some playing time last year for Utah. He is a pretty talented guy. I was very surprised that he transferred to Vanderbilt, but from everything that I've seen, he's very intelligent and knows what he's doing, especially on the football field. I am really excited to see what he can do here, but the next thing that I want to talk about is my second storyline, and that's that there's been a quarterback battle between Diego Pavia and Nate Johnson. I'm not sure who's going to win. I always lean towards seniority, so I think Pavia is going to win. But both of these guys, I don't know if they're SEC caliber quarterbacks, but if there's anybody that I'm excited to see, it's going to be Nate Johnson. And mark my words, you will see pretty much an equal amount of both of these guys because Vanderbilt is going to struggle all year long. And I'm guessing that their head coach is going to give them both an opportunity to see if they can make games competitive or not. So the quarterback battle will really not be won or lost by either quarterback. They're both going to see time on the field. But then the last thing I want to talk about with this Vanderbilt team, not really having to do with a preview for this season, just more of a talking point of how do you make this team better? And there's 2 things that you can talk about. Number 1, the long-term answer, I guess, is creating some kind of NIL collective that pairs money with academia and finding the smartest athletes around the entire country, I guess. Kind of like Stanford did a few years ago with like Christian McCaffrey and Andrew Luck. Although you're going to have to recruit from a more diverse academic basis, I guess. I'm not phrasing that correctly, but it's never going to work with an academic standard and a tough conference where you can never win enough games to advertise yourself as a conference championship contender. So I guess one answer would be to create some kind of massive NIL collection to advertise to all these athletes. We're going to pay you a lot of money. But in the short term, the answer is it's not going to happen, just because there's no booster that wants to pay Vanderbilt or pay Vanderbilt athletes millions of dollars to watch them go 5-7 and maybe 6-6 one year, but then go right back to being like 3-9. So the second thing I want to talk about is that Vanderbilt could leave the SEC to go to another conference and be more successful, but it's never going to happen because Vanderbilt makes $50 million a year from the SEC TV deal. You can't get that anywhere else except for maybe the Big Ten, and I can almost guarantee you the Big Ten is not accepting Vanderbilt into their conference. So they could go down to the Sun Belt and play competitively and contend for championships, but when it comes to money, it's not really the same. You got to take the $50 million every single time. It's kind of like these lower FBS teams and FCS teams that get paid like $750,000, $1 million to go play against an Alabama, a Texas. Vanderbilt basically does that, but for way more money. $50 million a year, and you just got to get your butt spanked, 8 or 9 times a season. That's like $5 million a game. That's way more than any of the other teams get paid. So Vanderbilt's never leaving the SEC unless the SEC decides to kick them out, which that's not happening. But let's go ahead and wrap up our SEC preview with the record prediction for Vanderbilt. First game versus Virginia Tech. I believe it's at home. This is still a loss. Virginia Tech, in my opinion, is a sleeper team this year, and I think they're going to come in and mollywop Vanderbilt in Nashville. Next game versus Alcorn State. Even though Vanderbilt is one of the worst rosters in the FBS, I will give them the dub versus Alcorn State. The talent disparity there is pretty large, so Vanderbilt gets the edge. At Georgia State, I think that that's a very tough game for this team to play, but I will once again give them the SEC benefit of the doubt and say they get a win here. But then we go 3 straight losses at Missouri versus Alabama, at Kentucky. All 3 of those are extremely tough games, regardless of what team you are in the SEC. But when you have, quote unquote, the worst roster in the conference, I give the edge to the rest of these teams. Maybe they could compete in the Kentucky game, but outside of that, I don't see it. Versus Ball State at home, good non-conference small FBS school. I will give Vanderbilt the win there. We've got them at 3 right now, but then 5 straight losses versus Texas, at Auburn, versus South Carolina, at LSU, and then at home versus Tennessee. The one game that I could see them pulling off is at home versus South Carolina. Shane Beamer is not necessarily on the hot seat right this second, but I think he will be at the end of the year. Those kind of conversations always destabilize football programs. So I will give Vanderbilt a maybe on the South Carolina game. But outside of that, that's 5 straight losses to close out the year and a 3-9 season to end it all. I'm not sure if Vanderbilt's going to make a coaching change, but they've definitely got to make a roster change if they want to be any better. I just don't necessarily think that that's going to be the case. So 3-9. Not the worst Vanderbilt season in the entire world. I think they went 2-10 last year, so improvement. But thanks again so much for tuning in to all of these SEC previews. We're going to be doing the Big 12 next, so stay tuned for that. Thanks again for watching, and we'll see you next time.